All right, so what we do in this paper is we investigate firms' incentives to donate and what the shareholder wealth implications of donating are. Now, this is a very contested issue in the literature, at least partly driven by the fact that corporate philanthropy is highly endogenous in nature. Now, as you may be able to tell from the title of the paper, we'll try to tackle some of these issues in the context of natural disasters. And I'll explain in more detail later on how we can deal with this. But let me first go into this. So to me, this feels like half of a lifetime ago, but just a couple of months ago, Australia actually faced some of the largest bushfires it has seen in its history. So the size and the severity of these bushfires triggered people from all over the world to donate money to the victims of these bushfires. So we had people, celebrities, but also corporations donating large amounts of money and resources to these bushfires. And in fact, if we take a look at this list with the biggest donors for these bushfires, 12 out of the 18 donors in this list are actually corporations. So we have, for example, the big 4 banks in Australia, which are Commonwealth, NAB, Westpac, ANZ. We have firms like Seven Group, News Corporation, Crown. We have the local grocery stores, Coles and Woolies, but also international firms like Facebook, for example. So all of these firms donated large amounts of money in terms of disaster relief. So it seems like corporate giving is a very important component of disaster relief. But it also triggers a very different type of question. And that is, why do firms engage in corporate giving? What do they stand to gain if they can gain anything at all? Now, this question has been investigated in the literature, and there's actually 2 broad views on corporate philanthropy. Now, according to traditional economic theory, we should not see firms engaging in corporate giving at all. They should not bother with handing money out to charities. Firms' only focus should be to maximize shareholder value. So a number of studies have investigated this agency view on corporate giving, and they have actually found that a lot of corporate giving is agency motivated. So it's done by insiders or managers that want to extract private benefits. So they can do this by donating to affiliated charities or to local politicians. And as such, corporate giving can reflect much deeper agency concerns in the firm, such as, for example, reduced monitoring. So according to this agency view, corporate giving can decrease shareholder value. There is, however, also a second view on corporate giving. And this is based on the doing well by doing good argument from the CSR literature. Now, we will refer to this as strategic philanthropy. And under the strategic philanthropy view, firms can use corporate giving as a marketing and reputation building tool that they can use to boost sales, attract customers, and overall build their social image and stakeholder support. Now, some even argue that they can use it to lower future litigation costs, or they could use it to bond employees to the firm, increasing retention and decreasing turnover. So according to the strategic view, corporate giving can also increase shareholder value. Now, these 2 views are highly contested in the literature, at least partly driven by the highly endogenous nature of corporate giving. So there's a lot of underlying variables that drive both the decision to donate and any firm value effects. Now, it could even be that firm value drives the decision to donate rather than the other way around. So we'll try to tackle some of these issues, and we'll do that by looking at the context of natural disasters. Now, how does this setting help us alleviate some of these issues? Now, first of all, most natural disasters are unanticipated events. So that means that we can look at corporate actions in the context of natural disasters, and we can investigate this in an event study setting. So this will allow us to already take into account a lot of these underlying firm value drivers that would otherwise affect this type of analysis. And it will also help us to take into account the reverse causality issues. There is also a large second benefit, and that is that it can help us distinguish more precisely agency-motivated donations from strategic donations. Now, how can we use this setting to do this? In a natural disaster setting, the strategic benefits of donating, strategic philanthropy, will become relatively more important relative to agency-motivated donations. Now, why is that the case? Natural disasters are typically very large, salient events that affect a lot of people, even those that are not located in the affected areas. Now, it affects managers and investors' risk perceptions. So Dessin-Matre, for example, show that it affects firms' cash holdings if they have experienced a natural disaster. And they're also highly mediatized. So if you think about the COVID crisis, for example, there's unimaginable amounts of media attention that get drawn to these types of disasters. So any corporate action in the context of a natural disaster will grab investors' attention much more than the same corporate action in a non-disaster setting. So as a result, investors will react much more strongly to corporate disaster relief giving in the context of a disaster relative to a non-disaster setting. In other words, the saliency of such an event will amplify the value effects of donating. And because the value effects are affected, firms' incentives to donate will also be affected. So investors will overreact mainly to the strategic effects of corporate giving. So the reputation building effects of corporate giving will be increased in a natural disaster setting. Now, as a result, firms' incentives to engage in agency-motivated donations will decrease, and their incentives to engage in strategic corporate giving will increase. So overall, we expect that the firm's abnormal returns will reflect strategic philanthropy much more as disaster saliency increases. And this is how we will investigate and distinguish these two views on corporate giving. Now, the model that we use to test this is shown here. So our dependent variable is the firm's abnormal returns in the 23-day window following the disaster event. Now we look at a 3-week window following the disaster, mainly because our data source actually doesn't tell us the exact date on which the firm donated. And I will come back to the data source in a bit, but I think it's safe to assume that the large majority of firms will likely announce their donation in 3 weeks following that disaster. So that is why we use this 3-week window. Now we regress these abnormal returns on an indicator for whether or not the firm donated, as well as a bunch of firm, industry, and country level controls and fixed effects. Now, like I said, we use the unanticipated nature of a disaster to use this event study setting. This will help us decrease some of these reverse causality concerns. And we'll also focus mainly on the firms in unaffected areas. So this is because we want to make sure that we're capturing the market's reaction to firms' disaster relief giving rather than to the disaster itself. So we'll mainly focus on these unaffected firms. Now our data consists of over 28,000 publicly listed firms from all over the world. So the sample runs from 2006 to 2018. And our data source for corporate giving is Foundation Maps. Now, Foundation Maps is an international database. It covers donations by all kinds of charities and institutions, and also corporate charities. And the data looks a bit like this. So we have a lot of information here. We know who the funder is, where the funder is located. We know who the recipient is, where the recipient is located. We know the amount of the grant duration, the subject, geographic area served, and a grant description. So we can pin down quite precisely what the purpose of this donation was and link it to a specific disaster. Now, the only thing that Foundation Maps does not tell us is the exact date on which this grant was awarded or when it was announced. So we know the year, but we don't know the exact date. And that is why we will use this 3-week window following the disaster. Now our data on disasters is from MDAT. MDAT is also an international database, and it covers all disasters that were associated with at least 100 people that were affected, or 10 people dying, or that resulted in an international call for help or a state of emergency. So these are all relatively large disasters. Our total sample is at the firm disaster level. So we're only looking at the unaffected firms here. And I should say that we only look at combinations of firms that are located or headquartered in the country where the disaster occurred. So if we do that, we end up with a total sample of 218,000 observations. Now our sample distribution looks like this. The countries that are indicated or shaded darker are the ones that occur relatively more often in our sample. Now these are typically countries with either a higher number of disasters or a higher number of publicly listed firms. So you can see that the US is highly represented in our sample. We have China, India, but also Australia. And we overall have quite a good coverage from all over the world. Okay, now how will we use this setting to try and distinguish these agency motivated donations from strategic donations? Like I said, we'll exploit natural disasters as salient events. So we expect that the firm's abnormal returns to their disaster relief giving will reflect strategic philanthropy more, the more salient the disaster, but also the more important the firm's reputation and their social image. So we'll use a set of proxies for both of these factors. Now, in terms of disaster salience, we'll look at the type of disaster, the disaster severity in terms of damage caused. We'll look at the relevance of the disaster. And for that, we'll look at how often people actively looked up information about that disaster. And we'll also have some tests for distance. So we'll look at where the firm is located relative to the affected area. And then in terms of proxies for reputation and social image, we'll look at a bunch of firm, industry, and country level characteristics that can proxy for this importance of reputation and social image. All right, let's take a look at some results then. So the results that you see here are for the model that I showed you before. Our dependent variable is the firm's 3-week hours following the disaster. Our main independent variable is a dummy for whether or not the firm donated. Now in the first column, we look at the full sample of disasters, and you can see that on average, donating destroys shareholder value. So donating firms earn 0.5% lower returns relative to non-donating firms in the 3 weeks following the disaster. Now this is actually consistent with most of the existing literature. So most of the literature has shown that corporate giving tends to be agency motivated and that it tends to destroy shareholder value. This is exactly what we see here. However, remember that I said that we expected the strategic benefits to be higher, the more salient the disaster. So in column 2, we take a look at only the large disasters, so large in terms of damage caused. And here you can see that the negative effect already becomes a bit weaker. So the strategic benefits do become more important, although agency still dominates. In the next 2 columns then, we distinguish disasters by their type. So we distinguish sudden from long-term disasters. Now we expect to not see anything for the long-term disasters. Now these are disasters like droughts, for example, which could take weeks, months, or even years. There is no reason to expect that a firm will donate or that the market would react in the first 3 weeks of such a disaster. And this is exactly what we find. So the market does not respond at all at the beginning of such a long disaster. However, all our results do appear when we look at the sudden, unanticipated disasters. And that's exactly what we expect. So these results do indicate that we're likely capturing something related to the disaster, rather than to another underlying firm effect. Now, on average, donations destroy shareholder value, but we expect them to, or returns to increase with disaster saliency. So we'll take a look at some proxies for disaster saliency. And the most obvious proxy is disaster severity, or the total damage caused. And that is what we look at here in the first column. So here we look at the total damage caused in terms of dollar values. And we find that even though the main effect of this donation is still significantly negative as before, firms actually, or returns actually increase by 0.6% for every % increase in disaster size. So this is in line with this idea that strategic benefits increase the more salient the disaster. We also look at a separate measure for disaster saliency, and we look at how often people actively looked up information regarding that disaster, so the search intensity. And we do that by looking at how often people Googled words like hurricane or earthquake or tsunami or storm. And this is what this data looks like. So you can see at the peaks for the search terms do peak exactly at the time of these disasters. We have, for example, the earthquake in Japan in 2011. We have Hurricane Harvey in the US. We have the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia in 2018, and a bunch of other hurricanes in the US. Now, if we take a look at this measure, we indeed find, as before, that the firm's returns increase by 1.7% for every percentage increase in the search intensity. So again, in line with the idea that strategic benefits increase the more salient the disaster and the more attention people pay to that disaster. In the last column then, we look at a dummy for large disasters. So these are the ones in the top quartile of the distribution. And here again, we see that the effects of strategic giving almost completely offset the negative agency effects that we see in the main effect. So I personally like these results because here we're looking at characteristics of the disaster. These are relatively exogenous, firms cannot influence them. And they show indeed that strategic benefits become more important as saliency increases. Now we also take a look at some other characteristics related to the firm or the industry. Now these are less exogenous, but they do allow us to pin down more precisely this reputation and social image effect. Now we'll, for example, take a look at firms that rely more on their reputation or their brand in general, like Apple, for example, or Coca-Cola, or Walmart is a very nice example because they saw a huge boost in their reputation after providing disaster relief following Hurricane Katrina. It could also be firms in strategic industries. So Allstate, for example, is an insurer in the US, and they have these mobile claim centers that drive around to affected areas. Or Duracell, who provided power banks to all of the affected people in New York following Hurricane Sandy. So we expect the strategic benefits to be higher for these types of firms. And that is what we investigate here. So we'll look at some proxies for the extent to which firms can benefit from these strategic effects of corporate giving. Now in the first column, we look at the firm's domestic focus. So domestic versus internationally oriented firms. And we expect that the strategic benefits are higher for the more domestically oriented firms. So these are firms that are more likely to have a local customer base, local suppliers, a local image. They can benefit more from building their local image. And that's exactly what we find. So although the combined effect is still negative, firms with a domestic focus that donate earn 1.2% higher returns relative to those with an international focus. We see a similar effect when we look at firms with high SG&A expenses. So SG&A expenses capture firms' marketing expenditure. So these are firms that rely more on marketing in their day-to-day operations. And we see a similar positive interaction coefficient. And we also find a similar effect when we look at firms with high R&D expenses. So these are firms that also rely more on building their customer base to offset the high initial costs that they might have. So overall, these results do show that firms that can gain more from using corporate giving strategically do earn higher returns relative to other firms. We then also look at some industry level characteristics. And we, for example, look at firms in what we call positively affected industries. So these are industries that are likely to see an increase in demand because of the disaster. So these could be, for example, construction firms or firms in health and legal services. So they could gain more from using corporate giving strategically. And indeed, that is what we find. So they earn 3.9% higher returns if they donate following a disaster. We also look at firms in more competitive industries. Now, these firms could use corporate giving to distinguish themselves from their competitors. And we also find that they also can gain more from using corporate giving strategically. So also these firms can gain more by donating. We then also look at some country level characteristics. And here we'll mainly focus on the role of the government and government's support in particular. So in the first column, we'll take a look at the extent to which other parties in a country provided disaster relief. So this could be other charities, other institutions, even individuals. And we actually find the markets react more negatively the more disaster relief was provided by the other players in the market. So the market does not like the fact that a firm gives a lot of money away if there are other people giving money. And we see a very similar effect in column 2, where we look at the sustainability score in a particular country. So this measures the regulations that are in a country with regards to sustainability, so how socially conscious a government is. And here again, we find a negative effect if a firm donates when it is in a more socially conscious country. Now we find the strongest effects when we look at the amount of emergency relief provided by the government. So if the country's government provides a lot of disaster relief for a particular disaster, then the market will react very negatively to the fact that a firm provides disaster relief. So there is a substitution effect that is going on here. However, when we look at a measure that captures more of the social norms and social values in a country, we do find a positive effect. So we look at how religious people in a particular country are, because it has been shown that people that are more religious are more likely to donate, or they perceive altruism in general more positively. And that is also what we find. So a firm that donates, that is in a more religious country, can gain more from the strategic benefits of donating. So we've kind of tried to pin down the strategic effects by looking at characteristics of the disaster and at some firm, industry, and country level characteristics. But you could still be worried that we're capturing things not necessarily related to the fact that a firm donates. So for that reason, we also have a separate analysis. So what we do here is we manually collected all of the announcements, press releases, newspaper articles, in which firms announced that they would provide disaster relief for a particular disaster. Now, obviously, the sample is much smaller here. We have about 700 observations. And these are only the observations for which we could find these donation announcements. So we don't have any non-donating firms in this sample. Now you can see that on average, the market actually responds weakly positively to the fact that these firms donates. And as before, this is mainly driven by the sudden disasters. Now this does make sense because we are capturing more of the medium and the large size disasters when collecting this information. So the market response is a bit more positive. However, when we look at the effects for our proxies for disaster saliency, we see very similar results as before. So every percentage increase in disaster size will increase the enhancement returns following the enhancement of this disaster relief by 0.7%. A percentage increase in search intensity similarly will increase enhancement returns by 0.6%. And as before, we also find very similar results for our dummy for the large disasters. So these results do confirm everything we've seen before. The market responds more positively to the fact that a firm donates if disaster saliency increases, in line with the idea that strategic benefits of donating become more dominant the more salient the disaster. Okay, in the next couple of minutes, I'll just briefly discuss some of these robustness tests and kind of sanity checks to ensure that we're measuring what we want to measure. And in this table, I actually focus on these last couple of columns. So here we want to ensure that we're actually capturing what we want to capture, which is the market's response to firms' disaster relief giving. So in this table, we'll also include the affected firms in our sample. So these are firms located in the affected zip codes, so directly affected by the disaster. Now we will split up our event window in a short event window immediately following the disaster event and the longer term window in the days after that. Now we expect that the market's response to the disaster itself will mainly be present in the short-term window, and that the market's response to the disaster relief giving will be present in the longer-term window. Now, if you look at the effect for the affected indicator, we find this is only significant in the short-term window. So this is in line with the fact that the market immediately responds to the impact of the disaster on these firms' operations or customers. It is no longer significant in the longer-term window after that. Now, when we interact this indicator with the donations indicator, we find very similar results as before. And we find that the effective donating is actually significant in both the short-term and the longer-term window. Now, this does make sense because firms tend to donate in both windows. However, the affected indicator is still only significant in the short-term window. So this does tell us that we're likely capturing the market's response to firms' disaster relief giving rather than to the disaster event itself. Now, we have tried to determine firms' incentives to donate by looking at their returns. However, we also directly investigate their incentives by looking at the probability of donating. So here we look at the likelihood that a firm donates following a particular disaster, and we use very similar proxies for strategic philanthropy as before. And by and large, these effects do confirm what we've seen before. So firms are more likely to donate for larger disasters. They're more likely to donate if they are more marketing oriented. So if they have higher SG&A expenses or if they are in more competitive industry. The only coefficient here that is negative is the one for the R&D expenses, but we don't have as precise industry controls here as we had before. So this could be driving that effect. We have a very similar table for a set of agency proxies. So we can confirm that both the strategy channel and the agency channel are both present. But from our announcement returns results, we can determine that strategic incentive dominates more as disaster saliency increases. Now to conclude, we want to investigate firms' incentives to donate and their value effects of donating. We'll investigate this question in the context of natural disasters because we use it as an exogenous event that will affect the payoffs of donating and firms' incentive to donate, because it increases the strategic benefits of donating relative to the agency motives. Now, on average, we find that the strategic benefits do not outweigh agency costs. So firms earn 0.5% lower returns when they donate relative to non-donating firms. However, we do find that strategic benefits of donating increase as disaster saliency increases and as the firm relies more on their reputation and their social image. So we find that firm returns are higher for larger disasters, for more marketing-oriented firms, for firms in more altruistic-oriented countries, and for those in countries in which government support is lacking in terms of emergent disaster relief. So overall, we find that corporate giving can be both agency motivated or strategic, but we find that strategic philanthropy becomes more important if firms can sufficiently boost their reputation and their social capital.